Hello, everyone. You are here to see the Seabird Monitoring Training, Stewards of the Coast and Redwoods and California State Parks for 2026.
Okay, so is my pointer showing on the screen? I'm
Yes,
moving it. I'm moving it around. Can you see it? Okay, good.
yes,
Because I'll be pointing some things out later on,
Yes,
and it
we
helps
can,
me to
yeah.
know that it's actually working. Okay, so this is a citizen or community science program, and I don't know how many of you have been involved with one of these programs before, but it's a way to observe with consequences, according to Mary Ellen Hannibal, who's written a fantastic book all about citizen science. And she says if you want to deepen your experience of life, the first thing to do is start observing. And if you're out observing wildflowers or seabirds or whatever you happen to be looking at, it's really helpful if you're also documenting what you're seeing, because there just aren't enough biologists to capture the kind of information that's needed on um, things like baseline data of what's going on. I recently found out within the last few years, there's no real data on the ranges of mushrooms in Marin and Sonoma County, which kind of surprised me. And in times of climate issues, it's really important to have that kind of data. So we're doing our part by going out and observing the seabird colonies that are nesting right off of our coast and documenting it, and also making those numbers available to the biologists who have responsibility for managing our local resources. So we're a chapter of the Seabird Protection Network. The Seabird Protection Network is statewide, and it works under the auspices of NOAA. And in this area, under the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary. And why do we monitor seabirds? They're the top of the food chain, so they're impacted by all the changes that happen throughout the entire marine ecosystem. They're sentinels of the health of the ecosystem, and they're visible. You can see what's going on above sea level without having to dive down and count the number of fish or the kinds of plankton that's available. Because they're at the top of the food system, so they tell us a lot about what's going on underneath. Climate change obviously has a profound impact on marine ecosystems, and so it's vitally important right now. And so monitoring seabirds helps us track climate-related changes in the environment, which ultimately impact the rest of us. And then there are climate impacts for some of these animals. I noticed that somebody had an oyster catcher um, on their a symbol for their name there, and we're kind of worried about what's going to happen with the habitat loss with sea level rise, because they're totally dependent on the offshore rocks. And most of all, becoming familiar with family life is just fun. There are some of us which enjoy monitoring rocks that are like a third of a mile offshore. And like Gulf Rock, for example, the counts are up to 8,000. I am particularly interested in the behavior, and so I prefer monitoring places like Bodega Head, the west side, where you have the proximity and you can see the personalities and the interactions between the individuals and then also between different species. So I'm going to start off with a short photo essay, which is kind of an intimate view of family life. This will be introducing you to the species that we monitor out there. We have 3 species of cormorants. They're all a little different. The largest and the chunkiest one over here is the Brandt's cormorant. And it's not showing in this photograph, but he's characterized by a bright blue gular or pouch. And I'll show you some photographs of what he looks like during breeding season. And the double-crested is down here on the lower middle. And you can identify a double-crested in flight because he's the one that has kind of a crooked neck here. And also his gular pouch is kind of a gold color. Up above him, we have the smallest of our cormorants. They're the pelagic cormorants. And they have a much more slender build than the other two. Down here in the lower left-hand corner, we have Diane's favorites. These are the pigeon guillemots, and these are most prominently seen off of Bodega Head. Now, if you like to explore Pinnacle's Gulch Beach, which faces Bodega Bay, Pinnacle Rock is host to probably 100 of them that are nesting there, and they're very, very playful, and they're very, very talkative. They chatter a lot, and they're seen jumping up and down off of the rock all the time. Up in the upper right here, we have a common murre, and they're kind of new to our coast. I used to scope a Brandt's cormorant colony that was on Gull Rock, which is the most northernmost of the sites that we monitor. And the common murres showed up suddenly in 2012. They'd never been there before. And they have been moving into our area from Washington and Oregon and other parts of Northern California, basically because of harassment by bald eagles. And so, although they only raise one chick a year, and they are loyal to each other and loyal to their site, they've become dominant, actually. They've taken over Gull Rock. Now they've moved down onto Bodega Rock, and 2 years ago they began breeding right off of Bodega Head on the west side. And then down here in the lower right-hand corner is my personal favorite, and that's the black oyster catcher. This is a photograph that's taken off of Bodega Head on the west side. And you can see that it's a nice mixed community of birds. This over here on the top left is the Brandt's cormorant. You can see just a bit of the bright blue gular over here on this one that's kind of hunkered down. They start losing their breeding plumage and coloration, the skin coloration, fairly soon after laying their eggs. Over here, we have a couple of the common murres, and they're standing around. They're kind of nosy. They like to figure out what's going on in everybody else's nest and everybody else's business. The only gull that we have that is a year-round resident here and actually breeds here is the western gull, although right now we probably have a variety of species, maybe 8 different species of gulls, but they'll be taking off to their own breeding grounds pretty soon. And I don't know if you can see it because they're very well camouflaged, but right in this area here, there are 2 spotted gull chicks. There are 2 little babies here. And they blend very well with the granite background that's on Bodega Head. And there's even a couple of pelicans, brown pelicans here, and they don't breed here. They breed in Southern California, but we do count them because they're one of the 3 amigos that comes up after breeding in Southern California, along with the Heermann's gulls and the elegant terns. And they're very large birds, and when they arrive, they can take over a rock. And that has an impact on the birds that are nesting on that rock, obviously. So we do pay attention to what they're up to as well. So we start off with courtship early in the season. And this in the upper left-hand corner here is a double-crested corm breeding costume. And what happens is that the skin around the face and around the eyes and the gular pouch down below turns this bright orange color. The eyes become quite turquoise. He's called a double-crested because of the crests here that look like ears. It's hard to see in this photograph, but not only do the eyes turn a turquoise color, but he actually has turquoise beads that encircle each eye. And what is most striking is the skin, the inside of the mouth turns this deep azure blue. Now, the only site that we do 4 sites that we're monitoring, the only site where the double-crested breed is Gleason. And you catch that deep blue throat in your scope, and it's really quite striking. It's really quite beautiful. And down here, you can kind of see this little brown pattern on his feathers. He's the only cormorant that has a scallop look from behind. And And you'll see what I mean when I show a couple more photographs of them. This is the Brandt's cormorant, and his gular pouch turns this turquoise blue, and he is in a breeding pose. He is on a nest, and he is advertising himself to a female. And here we have a couple of the western gulls that are breeding here, along with the oyster catchers up above. And the little pigeon guillemots, they're very striking. They have this contrast black and white plumage. But what's really incredible is their mouths turn a crimson red when they're breeding, and so do their feet. And so here they're showing off each other. They're showing off their throats to each other, just as these guys up here show off the azure blue throats. And here they are, they kind of spin around in the water. They're really, really playful. So the next step after courtship is the nest. And the nests vary. Up here we have a pelagic cormorant, and their preferred breeding territory is sheer vertical rock faces. And they breed on these little tiny shelves. There's not very much room. There's no such thing as sibling rivalry. It just will not happen here because they have a very limited space in which they can raise their families. They can be distinguished early on in the breeding season by these white flanks that are apparent. They're showing now, but they begin to lose those flanks pretty quickly once they start. They have eggs here that are visible, but once they start the eggs start to hatch and they have chicks, the white goes away. They have red skin around their throats and around their gular, and they're black birds, but in the sunlight they're really, really iridescent, and you can pick up some of that. They're deep greens and purples and blues. And again, they're the smallest and the most slender and delicate looking of the three species of cormorants. And they build their nest out of vegetation. Basically, it's normally algae. The black oyster catcher has a nest of pebbles or shells. And since this is granitic rock on Bodega Head, you can see how well camouflaged the eggs are. They blend really well with the granite. This one seems to have preferred pebbles for his nest. It looks very haphazard, but it's really quite deliberate. And in fact, they build practice nests throughout their breeding season before they get down to business. You'll see them walking along, picking up pebbles or pieces of shell with those long orange mandibles and tossing them over their backs. But it's not haphazard at all. It's a very deliberate process for them. Over here in the lower left-hand corner, there are two species of corms that are breeding. We have the Brandt's here that is on a cushy cushion here of vegetation. The only cormorant that will use sticks for their nest is the double-crested. They will use vegetation, they'll use seaweed, they'll use whatever they can find, but they're the only ones that will use sticks. They're the only ones that will breed in trees. They don't on our coast. But they're also the only one of our cormorants that will go inland and breed near fresh water. So if you walk around Spring Lake, for example, in Santa Rosa, you'll see them breeding in the trees there, colonies of them. So here's a cormorant. I'm very fond of this red algae, and bringing in some algae to add to the nests here. You've also got the western gull down here. They're also algae thieves. One time a couple of years ago, I was out at Bodega Head, and at the top of the rock was a pair of western gulls, and they had their nest. And then a few feet down was a pair of Brandt's cormorants, and they were on their nice cushy nest of algae. And below them was another pair of Brandt's cormorants. Well, the pair that was in the middle was getting kind of irritated with the gulls, and they were leaning up and they were kind of barking at the gulls, and they weren't paying attention to their own nest. And meanwhile, the pair below them was reaching up and ripping off, stealing algae from their nest. And so they're thieves as well as collectors. They also have little plumes, little white plumes on the sides of their heads during breeding season. And again, those disappear pretty quickly once they have chicks. And this is the colony off of Bodega Head. They will reuse, the Brandt's cormorants will reuse their nesting site year after year. And so they're building with fresh algae on top of the old algae. It gets pretty cushy. Here you get a sense of that bright blue gular or pouch. And this fellow isn't impressing anybody with that little stick in his mouth there. This is another photograph taken from Bodega Head, and we have the Brandt's cormorants. This one is displaying here and showing off his bright blue pouch, as is this guy. And here the common murres have moved in. Now, common murres have a habit of prospecting. I have a Google Drive that has a bunch of resources on it. There's a couple of really good papers on how the common murre will prospect a Brandt's cormorant colony. And if it looks like a good place for them to raise their young, they'll eventually move in. And this is what happened up at Gull Rock in 2012 when a few showed up and eventually took over, basically because they arrive earlier than the Brandt's corms, but also they're pushy and they're stubborn. Sylvia, one of our monitors that spends a lot of time on Bodega Head, refers to them as little bowling pins. They just kind of move in. They're nosy. They're looking into what everybody else is doing, and they just kind of hunker down and they can take over. So a few years ago, one site that we monitor is Bodega Rock, which is out in Bodega Bay, and our vantage point is the southern tip of Bodega Head. And Rich had noted in one of his notes, it was, oh, this is odd. There are a couple of common murres that are in the water here. I've never seen them here before. And sure enough, they were prospecting, and a couple of years later, there were 1,500 of them breeding on Bodega Rock. And now this is happening on Bodega Head, right off of the west side of Bodega Head. And the interesting thing is that the literature says that it is uncommon for us to view the formation of a common murre colony. And since this program started in 2013, we've been watching the formation of 3 colonies right off of our coast. So here is, and this pair has preferred little scraps of shell as part of their nest rather than the pebbles. You'll see one of them on a rock, and while the other one is off foraging. And so it's when the mate returns and they do a shift change that they'll get up, and it gives you an opportunity to view the eggs and count the eggs. And again, this photograph shows you how well their eggs blend in with the granite background. And the western gulls, their nesting material is generally vegetation that they find, and they pull it up off of the ground and they bring it to their nest site. This is a perfectly respectable nest, but for the size of the little scoop that he's chosen here. But we came back 2 days later and it had grown considerably, and it was rather unstable. So this one up here is trying to protect the egg. This guy down here is bringing more vegetation up to the top, thinking that's going to help, and of course it's not. They're both trying to save the nest. There you can see the egg that's kind of precariously perched there. And again, he's trying to dump more vegetation onto it, thinking that's going to be helpful. They're still working on it. And finally, they get it settled in. Now, western gulls are very, very site loyal, not just to the individual rock that they choose, but spot on the rock. And this pair, year after year after year, only raised a family of 1 chick. And I found that curious because most of the others either had 2, 3, or 4 chicks in their families. And then I realized that they have a very small scrape, and there's really only room for 1 chick to move around and survive there. What's happened now is that last year, there were so many common murres that were moving in onto this rock and taking up space that the gulls, their preferred nesting sites that they were very loyal to, were already occupied. And so they were being pushed out onto the outer edges of the rock. And I was noticing that they were building nests there and wondering, oh, there's just not room. This is not going to work. And of course, it didn't. They lost chicks when they hatched. They're very stubborn. There are lots of surrounding rocks that they could use. There's plenty of room, but they are so site loyal that this is their place. This is where they have been nesting for years and years, and they're very reticent to give it up. There's a video. I sent out a list of resources for most of you yesterday, and there's a list of websites that are helpful, and are some videos, and one of them shows the gull territorial instincts, and it's the way that they behave and mark out their territory on a rock. And it's actually herring gulls that are in the video, but they look very much like our Western gulls and how they behave. And so I recommend that video to anybody that's watching, because it'll give you an idea of when you see the Western gulls in action and staking out their territory, you'll recognize their behavior and what they're up to. So besides being a little over ambitious, what other challenges do they have? And of course, predation is a concern. There are common ravens that nest out there. And though I've never seen a raven go after a chick or an egg, the oyster catchers are very wary of them. And so this is a photograph of an oyster catcher chasing a raven off. And this is really quite brave. The oyster catchers don't really have any kind of weaponry. They don't have talons. They have these funny little flesh feet with these funny little black toenails. And they do have that long mandible, but they also have a high, shrieky voice that they use to communicate with each other. They can be heard over the surf, but also to chase away what they view as a threat to their nest or their family. This is a pair of raven fledglings. They had just left the nest for the first time. They landed on this rock, and they were about 5 or 10 feet apart. And one of the oyster catchers flew over and was, with this high-pitched voice, was nagging at them, and they huddled close in together. And I kind of love this posture because it's so un-raven-like. They don't have the raven attitude. And in fact, they still have a little bit of pink showing at the corners of their mouths here, and their plumage is not yet turned that shiny black. I'm very fond of ravens. And this is a juvenile peregrine. Up until a couple of years ago, we had 5 pairs of peregrine falcons in this area that we monitor, and they were the most prominent were a pair that nested at Gleason. And they had been there for quite some time. And oddly enough, and this is a juvenile, you can tell because of the vertical bars on his breast feathers here. And I don't know if you can make it out, but he has really serious talons here. And this is just a juvenile. He's hatchier here. We've lost them a couple of years ago due to the avian flu. One of their prime prey are water birds, who are especially susceptible to avian flu. And although they pose some threat to our breeding seabirds, they also perform a protective factor, because they're breeding there. They don't like other aerial predators. And so they were actually protecting them from a pair of bald eagles that hangs out up at Jenner at the mouth of the river. And so we're kind of hoping for their return. And here's a peregrine falcon that's picking off a little grebe in the Bodega Harbor. So the next step after building a nest is raising the family. And the Western gulls have really, really cute little fuzzy, round, spotted chicks. And these gulls are just super patient and super loving. As the chicks grow, they become a little obnoxious and they actually lose their cute stage when they become teenagers because they start growing real feathers on their bodies, all except for their heads. So they're these large birds with real feathers, brown feathers, and these little spotted fuzzy pinheads for quite some time. And in fact, a sister group that monitors up near Sea Ranch, north of us, and up near Balala, they were photographing Western gulls and at different stages throughout their growing up until they fledged so that they could have a photographic record of what they looked like at 4 days old, a week and a half old. And they didn't have any photographs of that intermediate stage because they weren't as cute, I guess. And here's a pair of little chicks. They're sitting out looking at the shore, looking at the seashore with their parents here. It left in this nest, and I don't remember if it was no longer viable or if it just hadn't hatched yet. And we're back to our oyster catchers here that are nesting with their nest of pieces of shell. And when their chicks hatch, they're wet and they're exhausted and they're just laying there for a couple of hours. And it's concerning at first, but then once they rest up and they dry off, they immediately start racing around the rock, hunting for insects. And just like human toddlers, they really enjoy climbing. So this guy, he immediately started climbing up the rock, but the granite is kind of decomposing in a lot of areas, and it's really slippery. He's having trouble getting down, but now he's discovering that he has stubby little wings, a stubby little bill. So he's supporting himself. And Dad is down here keeping an eye on things. And he finally makes his way back down to Dad. Now, I can tell that this is Dad. The oyster catchers, the male and the female look very much alike. The only difference is the pupil and iris of the eye. And if you look closely, you can see that the pupil is absolutely round. And this is characteristic of a male oyster catcher. The female will often have a little black blotch that's going off in one direction or the other. And so that is how you can identify the male from the female with these oyster catchers. He didn't stay very long as he ran right back up this little hillside here and figured out that he could slide down sideways. So they figured things out pretty quickly. Again, I mentioned that they don't have talons. These are these funny little black toenails sticking off of their pink feet. So they're being fed. They usually nest near mussel beds, California mussel beds. And the California mussels are the foundational species of their own little ecosystem because there are generally like up to 25 different species of invertebrates that are living within a mussel bed itself. Little isopods, worms, and whatever. And so when the chicks are this size, these are very small chicks. In fact, there's an egg here that's yet to hatch. They'll go off and forage and they'll bring back worms and little bugs and little isopods that are living in the mussel beds. He brought back a big piece of mussel meat, and I was surprised at whether or not this guy was going to be able to handle something this size, but he scarfed it right down. And here's an oyster catcher chick that has gotten a little bit older. He has a larger body here, and you can see that his mandibles are starting to grow out. And so then what the parents do is they start, instead of bringing mussel meat or worms, they start bringing the whole mussel shell. And they have to demonstrate how to break into this shell in order to get the meat that's enclosed inside. And you can see that there's been quite a few feeding lessons that have been going on here by the number of shells that have collected. Junior's getting a good look here. And finally, he's getting his dinner. Now, they have different modes of feeding. They have these long bills. Some of them are stabbers, and you'll see them um, stabbing at barnacles or limpets that are on a rock. Um, most of them use the mandibles like pliers, and they manipulate. The muscles are really good because it's a large piece of meat for the effort involved. But they have to learn to manipulate their mandibles like pliers in order to break into the muscle and extract the meat. And they do not reach adulthood and breeding age until they're 5 years of age. But even though they've been around for 5 years and kind of hanging out with their parents for a lot of that time, many of them still haven't mastered the dexterity and the skills that are necessary to feed a family. And so those that are feeding their families are often quite a bit older than 5 years of age. And are the common murres. In the lower left here, you see that there's a pair here and they are guarding a precious egg. And they don't use anything, they don't use any kind of vegetation or anything else as a nest. They just nest on bare rocks. Their eggs are oval shape, and so they don't roll off of a rock. If they start to roll, they just kind of spin. And over here on the we have a young common murre chick, and we have another one on the upper left here. They're very tiny. Now the common murres, they only stay on the nest or on the rock for about 3 weeks after they hatch. And so then the dads leave the rocks and they go down and they're swimming around in the sea below and they're calling the chicks. The chicks have not grown flight feathers yet. And so they're not equipped for flying. And it's a real leap of faith. They jump off of the rock, normally around sunset, to avoid so they're hidden, they're less obvious to potential predators. And they leap off of the rock and they join the dads and then they swim. They're totally dependent upon local food supply. They have enormous sternums to support the musculature, to support the wings, because they actually fly underwater. They once they grow out their primary feathers, they fly in the air, obviously, but they are really built for diving and for flying underwater. They're like bullets underwater. But if the food supply is not local, then it's really, really rough for them. And we had a marine heat wave that was quite severe, began in the fall of 2014 and went into 2016. And the local food supply was very, very sparse, and they were washing up in large numbers on our beaches. Those of us that do beach watch surveys were documenting the wash-ups. We had one stretch of beach south of the Salmon Creek that was only about 1.5 miles long, and in September of 2015, we had 95 dead birds, or dead animals. Most of them were the common murres that had just come off of these rocks. The pelagic cormorants, and these tiny little shelves, these tiny little ledges, and this is a family with 3 or 4 little fuzzy chicks here. Again, I mentioned that they're cooperative rather than practicing sibling rivalry. They're very, very affectionate. They're very, very loving. I've become really fond of them over the years, after watching them and how sweet natured they are with each other. This is a rock. This is part of the Bodega Head here. And you can see that one is exercising his wings and his pectoral muscles. And it's really fun watching them watching an adult fly into a nest in the wind there, because sometimes they'll have to peel off and make 2 or 3 attempts to land on these little tiny shelves in a strong wind. Here's another family, another nest, showing you the size of their territory here. You can tell these chicks have grown larger, but they have not picked up the iridescent. They're not shiny like their parents are. They're still this dull color. Here's a very small nest. And this chick on the left, chick number 1 here, is taking his turn exercising his pectoral muscles and his wings. Chick number 2 gets his turn. And chick number 3 gets his turn. So they actually take turns. There isn't room for anything else. Whereas with the gulls, they have all kinds of rooms. So they're jumping up and down and they're exercising their wings. And every now and then a gust of wind will come and pick one up, and it's rather surprising to them. And they look rather startled and they're not quite sure what to do about it. So do these wings really work? Okay, this is a pelagic cormorant family. And this guy's siblings and parents were calling to him down below. He was a little reticent to make his first jump, and he did, but he landed on a nearby rock. He didn't quite make it down, and they kept calling and calling. And finally, he made the plunge. So this is a pelagic animal that makes his living in the sea. It's really exciting to see him hit the sea for the first time. And out at Bodega Head in August, if there's a good strong wind, then it's flight school. And you'll see the adult gulls taking off and soaring overhead. They're very, very strong flyers, and they're calling to the chicks. The chicks are brown, and they take off. They don't land very well in a strong wind. It's really kind of amusing. So when they fledge, this is just the beginning. Only 10% of juveniles survive their first year. The black oyster catcher fledgling success is very, very low. There are 3 sites off of Bodega Head where they've been known to breed. There's only 1 site that has been successful year after year after year. And oddly enough, that is on an offshore rock that is shared with a lot of gulls. And the group up at Walala Island and Sea Ranch has noticed the same thing going on up there. And so we figure that perhaps the gulls offer some kind of protection for them. As I mentioned before, they reach sexual maturity about 5 years of age, but they need to become skilled at foraging in order to successfully feed a family. The western gulls, they need to make it 4 years before they reach breeding age. And all of our cormorant species reach sexual maturity at about 2 years of age. So this is a sign that I saw down at Pacific Grove in January of 2013, just before this program began. And I was really pleased to see that they were warning people to be cognizant of not only the harbor seals that are down there, but also the oyster catchers, which you are monitoring. So are there any questions before I go into species identification and the standard codes? I haven't been monitoring the chat. Is there anything in the chat? Are there any questions? Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the logistics and the species that we monitor and the forms. So we use a 4-letter code, and these are standards that are determined by the American Ornithological Society. And you'll notice that a lot of our species are composed of 2 words: western gull, common murre, pigeon guillemot. And they usually take the first 2 letters of each one of those words in order to form the code. So western gull would be WEGU, common murre would be COMU, pigeon guillemot is PIGU, brown pelican BRPE, and peregrine falcon is PEFA. And although I like to try to avoid jargon, you will hear us talk about a wegu for a western gull or a camu for a common murre. There's just kind of a verbal shorthand that goes along with the written shorthand. The surfbird, the species name is surfbird. It's only one word. And so the code is the first 4 letters of that word. Then we have our cormorants. And the pelagic cormorant follows the standard. It's the PE from pelagic and the CO from cormorant. You notice the double-crested cormorant is 3 words. And so the code uses the first letter of the first word, first letter of the second word, and the first 2 letters of the last word. So DCCO. Brandt's cormorant is an outlier. If it were to follow the convention, it would be BRCO, which is also the code for a brown cowbird. So in order to distinguish the two, it was determined that a Brandt's cormorant would be referred to as a BRAC, B-R-A-C. So that's the outlier. The other outlier is the Canada goose, so that it's not confused with a cackling goose. So that's a CANG, and actually there's a pair of Canada geese that breed out at Gleason. So our western gull, this is the only gull that is resident year-round and that breeds here. He has a darker mantle than the California gull or the herring gull that are still around right now, actually. They're hanging out around Salmon Creek especially. And can anybody tell me what the 4-letter code is? You can unmute yourself. Okay, so it's the GU. And here's what the western gull family looks like with the little spotted chicks. And this is our common murre, which is like our penguin. And the 4-letter code is COMU. And the pigeon guillemot, they have these obvious bright red feet and the bright red throats and the white patches on their wings. And their code is PIGU. And by the way, we have a legend that is in our clipboard that has all of these codes on it for you so that you don't have to memorize them. But you'll find that we deal with a limited number of species and it becomes second nature pretty quickly. And then here are 3 cormorant species. And again, here's the Brandt's cormorant, who has the blue pouch, the blue gular here, the turquoise gular. And here is the slender pelagic corm, who has the red skin around the eye and going up into the bill here. And here is the double-crested, who has the orange gular pouch. And this is the scalloped pattern I was talking about when seen from behind. There's brown in the feathers, where the Brandt's cormorant is pure black. They also have different preferences in terms of terrain. Like out at Gleason, the Gleason Rock is a large rock. It's flat on top, and the Brandt's cormorants prefer that flat territory. The double-crested will use that flat territory, but they'll also nest on the slopes, the down-facing slopes, where the pelagic are always on that vertical wall with those little shelves. So if you're unsure, another clue, if you can't see the bright colored gular, or if they've already lost some of their breeding patches and some of their breeding plumage, the terrain that they've chosen is another clue. And here's the Brandt again. And the 4-letter code is BRAC. And the double-crested, and again, you can identify the double-crested in the air by the crooked neck. And this is a youngster, this is a yearling, and they have light-colored breast feathers. And this is the wonderful mask that they put on when they're in breeding plumage with that bright azure blue throat. and the bright orange pouch here, and the turquoise eyes, and of course the crests. And the 4-letter code for that is DCCO. And there's our little pelagic. Here, this one is laying on eggs, 3 eggs here, and still has the white flanks here. Here we have a family of young chicks, and you see the white has disappeared already. So if you see the white flanks, you know it's a pelagic cormorant. If you don't see white flanks, it doesn't mean that it's not a pelagic cormorant. It just means that it's a little bit older and it's a little bit farther along in its breeding season. And that's a PECO is their code. And I talked about the nest material before. In the black oyster catcher, the code for that would be BLOY. And here's the Canada goose. By the way, this is photographic Gleason, and one of the things that I really enjoy about Gleason are the wildflowers. And here you have the sea thrift that's in full bloom. And the Canada goose is the other outlier along with the Brandt's cormorant, so that's a CANG. And the common raven, CORA, Cora. And the falcon, that follows the standard, and that's a PEFA. So here's a quiz. Does anybody want to hazard a guess as to what this is? How about one of those that's less experienced with seabirds? Nobody wants to? Okay, this is the common murre, black oyster catcher, western gull, and this is the Brandt's cormorant with the bright blue pouch here. This is a really nice photograph showing the crests on the double-crested cormorant here. So something about the logistics and equipment. We supply all of the equipment. We have a duffel bag that is stored at the Salmon Creek Ranger Station. We have a weather instrument. We have a kestrel in there. It's a weather instrument. Some people don't like using it, and some people do like using it. So it's there if you want. It will measure the wind, both gusts and speed, and it will also measure temperature. Some of us just prefer to use a Beaufort scale, which is also provided in the clipboard as a reference for you. The Beaufort scale for determining wind, and people like to use their phones for the temperature, which is recorded on the data sheets. We supply binoculars, a couple of tripods, a couple of spotting scopes, a camera, because we start each shift by photographing the rock or the rocks, microcloths for cleaning the equipment, a clipboard, data sheets, section maps, which I'm going to go into, a legend, which I mentioned before, pencils and clicker counters. And the clicker counters are really helpful when you're doing a site like Gull Rock or Bodega Rock, where you're dealing with numerous birds, and it's much easier to just click them off in your hand than to count one by one by one by one. And you can bring your cell phone, your own field guide if you like. Some people like to bring a journal. Can anybody name this cormorant? You're all muted or you're all shy.
And you can
So
also put it in the chat.
And you can also put it in the chat. I can't see the chat, but
I'll read it out.
okay. Blue gular is the clue here, and the turquoise eye. We're very concerned about your safety, so we do not monitor during heavy rain, dense fog, or high wind. And can anybody name this one? This has the white flanks, and it's in a little shelf here. It's kind of a cushy little nest, actually. We do have a Google Drive that you're welcome to browse through. We have a folder that is loaded with articles and resources, and you're welcome to contribute to it whenever you find something of interest. Um, the common MERS are really interesting. So we have a lot of papers and a lot of articles about their lifestyle and their life history. They are loyal to their mates till death do they part. But there is a paper in there, it's kind of fun, on divorce and common MERS. It doesn't mean that they aren't continually checking out um, the rest of the colony in case they happen to lose a mate and need to replace one at some point, so they have an idea of who's a good provider and who isn't. We have a folder of checklists and how-tos, which mainly have to do with the equipment. Blank data forms are there. Completed data forms are there. When you complete your data forms, they go into the binder, and about once a month I come up and I clean them out and I bring them home and I scan them and I upload the scans to the Google Drive so that you have access to not only what's going on during the current year, but they're archived there all the way back to 2013 so that you can see what was going on in previous years if you're interested. We have photographs up there and video. We have the schedule that we keep up there and the volunteer manual and a contact list so that you have access to cell numbers for each other so that you can coordinate. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the data forms that we use. We have a supply of mechanical pencils. It's really helpful if they're nice and sharp. And we prefer that you print instead of using cursive writing because it's more legible. Be neat. Do not erase. You can either strike out mistakes or your earlier counts or add on to them. And the reason why is that prior to our program beginning, the group up at Sea Ranch and Walala were monitoring the colonies up on Walala Island, and the commercial interests up there love to set off fireworks for the 4th of July. And of course, it was the middle of the breeding season. And of course, this impacted the breeding colonies up there. And so they actually went to court. And if there are erasures on your original data forms, those could be interpreted as a change. And so we don't want to do any kind of erasing. We want to strike out our mistakes just in case there is some major disturbance that it can actually mean, depending upon the type of disturbance and the extent of the disturbance, it can mean a large fine. So we want to make sure that our data forms are, the integrity is intact on those. Include lots of notes. The numbers are important, but boy, it's the notes that paint a picture of what's going on in that environment. And I mentioned before that Rich, who does Bodega Rock, a few years ago, he just happened to have this note. Oh, this is odd. You know, this is interesting. There are a couple of common MERS that are in the water. And it didn't seem to mean much at the time, but we later realized that they were prospecting, and sure enough, they were breeding there 2 years later. So one other thing about the notes is that after each shift, somebody will write up a report and send it out to the group so that we can all benefit from it. And we'll have the counts in there, but then there's also a lot of description about what's going on in the environment. I saw a deer or, you know, an owl or whatever. There's one fellow that was new a couple of years ago, and he did his first shift report, and he opened with a haiku, and everybody loved it. And so everybody was opening their reports with a haiku from then on for that year. If there are no birds of that species, you want to place a 0 in the cell on your data form. So for instance, if you're doing Gleason, there are no common MERS that breed Gleasons. So under common MERS, it'll be 0, 0, 0, 0, 0 all the way across. If you're unable to complete a count for some reason, Gull Rock is generally done at 8:30 in the morning. It's early in the morning. It can sometimes be fogged out. So if you can't complete a count, then do not use a 0, but place an X in the cell. And that tells us that your count was not completed for one reason or another. And again, include lots of notes. This is what our primary data form looks like. We for the colony, start time, the cloud cover, the wind, in terms of the Beaufort scale. And there is a Beaufort scale. For those of you that are new and unfamiliar with them, you'll see one when we go out for our site visit, and you'll see one certainly when you're going out and shadowing for your first shift. We record the temperature in Fahrenheit and whether or not there's any precipitation. And here are those 4-letter codes. So this first line here is all about the Brandt's cormorant, and we have room for notes here. And the double-crested, pelagic, brown pelican, bloy, etc., and then other species down here. And then on the second page, on the back side, we have room for lots of notes. So we have a column for the species, and then anything else that you want to add. Sometimes there are harbor seals that are stretched out, especially in rocks around Gleason. And so people often count those, and they'll make notes about those. Up at the top, you'll see a section for pinnipeds, and we have stellar sea lion bulls, other stellar sea lions, and California sea lions, and otariidids that are unclassified, and harbor seals. The only place where we count the pinnipeds is on Bodega Rock, and Bodega Rock is a really interesting little community. It is loaded with California sea lions, as many as 5 or 6 or 7 huge stellar sea lion bulls. And for some reason, they stay to their own territory and seem to respect the breeding bird territory. One year they were starting to encroach on the Brandt's cormorants that were breeding there. And so we didn't know. Empirically, we kind of felt that there was a larger number of them, but without having done a count the year before, we had no way of really documenting whether there was any population pressure that was forcing them into the Brandt's cormorants breeding territory. And so we began counting them once again. Now, of course, that rock has also been taken over by the little tiny common murres. And so it's really become an interesting community. And this is a photograph, and it is covered here with common murres. And you can see that there are little cracks and crevices all over the place. And so, they've been counting like 8,000 of them. So to make counting easier, we've developed a sectional map. And so here's section 1, section 2, section 3, section 4. So you can count one area at a time. Makes it much easier. Your eyes don't tire. And this served another purpose. The first few years we were doing it, as I said, this used to be a Brandt's cormorant colony, and the common murres appeared in they first appeared in 2012. There were just a few of them. And because they arrived earlier and they were a little pushier and they're stubborn, and they prefer that flatter territory, as do the Brandt's cormorants. We were interested in what kind of pressure they were going to put on the corms. And sure enough, they began pushing the cormorants onto less desirable breeding territory until they pushed them out altogether. And so breaking it up into these sections served 2 purposes. And here's Gull Rock, and there are 2 other rocks here that they'll use for breeding. So what we've done is we've created a supplemental sheet for Gull Rock. And here we have all of those sections that you see on the map there. There's the top south and 2A top central. And so you can count all of the common murres for each of these sections. And your Brandt's cormorants if they're there, and the number of nests. And down below we have the subcolony 01 and subcolony 02, which are those ancillary rocks that were off to the side. And then on Peaked Hill, there is a cliff face there that pelagic cormorants will nest. And so there's a place for them. So then after you fill in, you do your counts and you fill in all these cells on your supplemental sheet, you have a room for totals down here. And then you can transfer those totals onto the primary data sheet. And these sheets change from time to time. Sometimes somebody comes up with a really good idea about something that works a little differently, and so we change it. So this one was last changed, you can see, in January of 2023. And at the end of each season, I send out a questionnaire, a survey about what worked well, what didn't work well, and suggestions for changes. And that's how the program has developed over the years. This is a photograph of Bodega Rock, which is in Bodega Bay. It's in the middle of Bodega Bay. You're looking right down the San Andreas Fault, right down the throat of the mouth of Tamales Bay here. And there's a lot of boating activity. There's a lot of recreation here. And this is the rock that is also covered with, it's a Brandt's cormorant colony. You can see all the Brandt's corms here. Now it's interspersed with a lot of common murres. Here's a close-up. Down here on this section of the rock here is a big Steller's bull. And here are some California sea lions that are resting here. And this side of the rock here on the left is just covered with California sea lions. And then Brandt's cormorants all along the top. And again, this is the only site where we count the pinnipeds. And the reason why is because obviously there's a lot of them here. They also tend to raft out in the water. You'll see the sea lions with the flipper sticking up in the air, and it's a way of thermoregulating them. One thing that's fun about Bodega Rock is that early in the season, you'll often see whales coming through as well. In Bodega Head West, we do a little differently than any of the other sites. And the reason why is because it's part of the marine protected area. And the Marine Protected Network was established in 2010. And when it was implemented, Point Blue came through and they did bird surveys, baseline surveys, so that later on they could, they had some kind of means of testing the effectiveness in terms of food supply for seabirds. Because of the restrictions on take in those areas. And so the rocks, the group of rocks that we have selected to monitor there is consistent with a sub-colony that they used. This is the only area where we actually do count what's on the water because, again, that's to be consistent with their counts, although we don't transfer the water totals onto the primary data form like we do for the other for those that are on the rocks. And these are the rocks that we count. Here's quite a number of Brandt's cormorants on one of these rocks. And then there are cliff faces that go all the way south. These are homes, these cliff faces here are homes to the pelagic corms. So we count those as well. And we have a slightly more complicated supplemental sheet that we use for counting simply because we have a large main rock. We have to kind of go up the hill to see what's on the backside. And we started counting the backside simply because that's where the common murres were starting to nest. Then we have surrounding rocks and the bluff face for the pelagic corms. And down here, totals for the total nests, total adults, total chicks, and then what we see on the water. And it's just these totals up here that are transferred over to the primary data form. This sounds really complicated, and it is, but you're with experienced people that have been doing this for a long time. And so it becomes quite easy, it becomes second nature. One thing that we do with Bodega Head West is that some of those surrounding rocks are quite low. And so we also indicate the beginning tide and whether or not it's rising or falling. And the back side of the supplemental sheets will have the tide charts for you. This is an example of one that is filled out for Gleason. And somebody has made a comment that there were 12 harbor seals on Rock Point, which is one of the surrounding rocks. A boat was fishing too close, and 2 western gulls flew off but soon returned. So it wasn't reported, it was a minor disturbance. And this is just another photograph of the community off of Bodega Head. So, are there any questions? I threw a lot of information at you, and part of it is because we do each of the 4 sites a little differently because of either their proximity or the species that are there or something of particular interest. But it really isn't as complicated as it seems.
We have a couple of questions in the chat I'll read. Chris was asking about map directions to the 4 different sites.
Okay, those are in the manual and are quite specific, actually, including road signs and everything else. And I would use those now if you want to scope out those sites on your own right now, you can do that. But I encourage you to shadow each one of them if your schedule allows, so that you can see what's going on there. See if the environment of each is different. The species are a little different. So I encourage you to check them all out. So you can scout them out using the manual, but when you're actually shadowing a shift, you can either meet people so that you can see how the equipment is picked up and then follow them to the site. But yes, all of those maps and specific directions are in the volunteer manual for you.
And then James is asking if it's useful to bring, for people to bring their own spotting scopes if they have one.
If you like, you're probably more comfortable with your own. If you don't have your own, we have the scopes, but quite a number of our monitors bring their own. And if you think you're interested in shopping for a scope, it's kind of a nice way to get some experience. They all feel a little different. The controls are in different places. There's obviously quite a difference in quality, not just between the manufacturers, but like Vortex, for example, makes 3 or 4 different quality levels in their scopes and their binoculars. But if you're going out to Gull Rock, for example, and 2 or 3 other people have brought their own scopes, it gives you an opportunity to kind of check out different manufacturers and different tripods. The tripods are all a little bit different as well because how their legs work. Some of them have cranks, some of them have clips. I go from tripod to tripod. I own 2 or 3 of them, and if I have been working with one tripod, I'm kind of lost with another one that I haven't picked up for a couple of months. And so you'll find that you'll be more comfortable with the way that some operate than the way that others operate. This gives you a really nice opportunity to check these out for yourself. There used to be before COVID, there was a optics and nature fair every year in the town of Sonoma. And it was a lot of fun. The bee people were there, and the beaver people, and the badger people, and the bird people. But they also had 8 or 10 manufacturers that all brought samples of their scopes and their binoculars. And it was a unique opportunity to go from booth to booth and be able to compare the scopes and the cameras. So yeah, you have your own, by all means, bring it. One of our first years, I was really pleased. There was a monitor who was new to birds and new to seabirds in particular. And she went through the season. And I remember she kept saying that she was never going to look at those offshore rocks the same. And she hit eBay and went shopping for her own scope. And so it was really rewarding. It was a rewarding experience for me to see somebody else get hooked on something that had given me so much pleasure over the years. And seeing Diane captured by it was really nice. Am I still sharing my screen here?
Okay,
Okay,
you're
good.
back. Um,
Okay, good.
there was another question, but I think maybe I'm willing to stay a little bit later and just out of we'll want to wrap up in the next few minutes, but
Yeah,
maybe
I'm sorry I ran over here.
no, you're perfect. I was going to say that I'm willing to hang around and answer questions that have to do with onboarding. And then maybe at the end we can answer James' last question. And I know those of you who are current volunteers, you don't have to suffer through the hearing about the paperwork part. So if you all want to log off, that's just fine. And thank you for coming. And if you are interested in volunteering, why don't you stay on for a few more minutes and I'll just give you a little overview of the process. It won't take long.
Oh, good. Diane put her blog in the chat.
Excellent.
Oh, why is Gull Rock Section 8 so small in size? Good question, James. I do not know. I suspect it was a leftover. Now that I shouldn't have closed my screen quite so quickly because I'd like to take a look at the map now.
Can we put it back up in a sec?
Yeah, I suspect it was,
You can find it.
let's see. Oh, I've already closed it down. I suspect it was a leftover. And I'm saying that because it's section 8, and I know that there's a funny little jog down at the base of it. And actually, it's a smaller section in terms of the population there as well.
Yeah, it looked like it was right in the middle of another section.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I should bring it up again then.
Okay, you find it and I'll just talk real briefly about the
Okay.
the next part of the process. So I want to mention that there's a team of us that Stewards has a small staff of 11 people, and 3 people help out mostly with the programs. And so Bet Merritt is our volunteer coordinator. And tomorrow, Bet is going to reach out to anyone who's not a current volunteer or is maybe volunteering for another program and also wants to volunteer for this program. And then we'll refer them to our program assistant, who's Elise, who will send an onboarding packet with kind of a checklist of things to do. There are some forms to fill out for state parks. And they are like the kind of forms you have to either have to figure out how to sign electronically or just print them out and sign and then send us back a good scan or photo. And then there's a state parks database that is where our volunteers record hours. And so Elise, the program assistant, explains that process. And we're really happy to help you walk through any part of the process you want. And if you're just feeling like you just want to mail stuff into us, we'll tell you how to do that as well. Just so you know, we're filling in for Elise, for Amelia, who's the State Parks Volunteer Coordinator. So they're quite a team of us that are around to help with all that. But you will get to know everybody if you become a volunteer. And there is let's see, we have a Google group that when you become a volunteer, we add you to the Google group, which is a way to share information and observations. And Hollis puts tons of resources on there. And so that's part of the way we communicate. Hollis creates a contact list for people, and with your permission, adds your contact information, your email, and your phone number to that so volunteers can contact each other for shifts, and then also puts a schedule out there for people to sign up for shifts on. Do you want to talk about the schedule at all, Hollis?
Yeah. We have 4 sites and we do each site once a week. And so on Friday mornings, we do Gull Rock, and that shift runs from 8:30 to 9:30. It takes a little time to get down the hill. We park up on Goat Rock Road, and it takes a little time to walk down the hill out to the point at the base of Peaked Hill and set up the equipment. And that's a Friday morning shift. On Saturdays, we do Gleason, and our shift time is 10 to 11. And we've always had a Saturday shift because it's handy for people that are working Monday through Friday. On Monday afternoons, we do Bodega Rock, and that's an afternoon shift from 1 to 2. And the reason that shift is in the afternoon is because the light is better at that time. We're looking south instead of west, and it allows time for the fog to clear, which is not an advantage of an early morning shift at Gull Rock. However, you want the sun behind you when you're looking west and you're trying to count off of a white rock. And then, let's see. So I've done Gleason. Oh, and Bodega Head, the west side of Bodega Head, we do on Thursday mornings. Our shift is ostensibly from 10 to 11 o'clock for Bodega Head West. However, it's a complicated area to count, and there are lots of little nooks and crannies. And lots of different rocks, and we are careful to pick up on, it's the only site where we move around. We have multiple vantage points from where we count, simply because of the topography there and the number of rocks that we're looking at. And we want to see what's going on the backside as much as possible, because that is where the common murres have collected. And so often that shift will last for 2 hours. The other thing about that site is that there's a lot of visitation, even though it's a Thursday morning. Especially in the summertime, there are a lot of visitors there, and we're big believers in public outreach. And so we like to talk to the people that are visiting out there about the breeding birds and what's going on. So those are the 4 shifts. Our season begins officially on April 1st, and it runs through the end of August. However, Gull Rock, because it's practically all common murres, and they leave the rock by the end of July, we often will stop monitoring a week or 2 into August at Gull Rock. The other rocks, Gleason starts a little bit later because there are no common murres there, and those species generally start a little bit later, but we actually start our shifts in April anyway. So that is how long the season runs. Because there was something else I was going to say about scheduling. When you sign up on the schedule, is usually somebody that's taking a look, and they will coordinate, via email. Somebody usually volunteers to pick up the equipment at the ranger station, and then somebody else usually volunteers to drop it back off at the end of the shift. I know what I wanted to say. There are one of the folders that are on the Google Drive is a folder of reports from last year. And I mentioned that at the end of every shift, somebody who is there will be assigned the job of being the reporter, and they will write up a report that goes out into that email blast to the entire group. So all of us know what's going on at every single site, every single week. And people actually look forward to seeing what's going on. If they've missed something, we ask for one shift, a commitment of 1 shift a month, but there are people that are out there every week. We can't keep them away. And so it's a way for people to keep up with what's going on everywhere else, or with their own rock if they've settled in one place and they're not there for a couple of weeks. Those are all, I take those and I archive them up onto the Google Drive. And so I encourage you to browse through some of those. You can see what's going on at these different sites. You can start to get a feel for it. And I go back to notes. You're painting a picture of what's going on in that environment, not just the dry numbers. The dry numbers have their place, but it's really the flavor of what else is going on there. So I encourage you to look through some of the reports, especially those from Bodega Head West from last year, simply because it was the formation of a new common murre colony, and it is unique among all of the sites in that you don't need a scope. It is right there. All you need are your binoculars, really. And you get a real sense of the personalities of the individuals that are involved. There aren't 8,000 of them. Okay, there are fewer numbers, but because of the proximity, you really get a feel for the individual personalities of the individual birds, plus the individual species and how they interact with each other. And so Sylvia, who was out there every single week last year, if it was Thursday morning, Sylvia was out there with her camera and documenting what was going on, and we all looked forward to her reports, because those of us that have been doing rocks that are a third of a mile out got a real nice picture of what was going out on the rocks that they had been monitoring for all of these years too. It's a close-up, in personal view. So I encourage you to look through some of those reports. It'll give you a flavor of what goes on at all of them.
And
Okay, so I looked at section 8, and it is a little pocket. I'd forgotten about that. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm pulling out the supplemental forms for Gull Rock, and I'm going to go through and see what has been recorded there and documented there, and I'll get back to you.
Copy that.
It's a funny little pocket inside the middle of that big number 5, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
And so
I just assumed there was some special something going on there.
And there has to be. So, and I don't do Gull Rock, so I'm going to have to go through some of the supplemental forms. And that's the other thing about having, as I mentioned, originally we were curious about the common murre's impact on the cormorants. And sure enough, they're little. They only stand, less than a foot high. But as Sylvia says, they're like stubborn little bowling pins. They get there early and they kind of lock in, and nobody's moving them. And sure enough, when we had it broken out into those sections, we could actually see their impact over the first 3 or 4 years on what they were doing to the cormorants. So the Brandt's cormorants left, they abandoned, for the most part, Gull Rock, and then that population down at Bodega Rock started increasing. We didn't have that many Brandt's cormorants on the west side of Bodega Head. Now it's loaded with them. So we've been watching this musical chairs, this musical rocks that's been taking place among these 4 different sites over the past 12 years, 13 years we've been doing this. So it's been an interesting process from year to year to year.
Maybe I missed this, but did you mention why the common murres are being so successful in terms of their numbers? Is it because they're successfully crowding out and therefore reproducing more successfully?
They're successful at crowding them out, but they're also moving down from Oregon, Washington, and parts of Northern California. Up at Humboldt State, there is Dan Barton has been doing a lot of research on the impact of bald eagles. And in fact, there's a statewide conference on Thursday, and he's doing a report. I'm kind of interested in what's going on up there. And the eagles have been harassing them, and so they've been moving down into our area, even though they only have 1 chick. And even though their population was really, especially with the hatch years, were really decimated during those years with the marine heat wave. I mentioned they come off of the rock, they can't fly. They are totally dependent on the local food source. And if it's not there, they just don't make it. But the bald eagles return, and the pressure that they have been exerting on them farther north has just been pushing them farther south. When we lost our peregrine falcons, there was a pair of bald eagles that have been hanging out since, I think, 2011 up at the mouth of the Russian River. And I was always interested, Gull Rock is not that far from the mouth of the Russian River, and I was always interested in why the eagles were not harassing that colony there. Well, it turned out it was the peregrine falcons that were keeping them in check, because the peregrine falcons were nesting there, and they don't like aerial predators because of their own their own families that they're raising. So there's this really interesting interconnection that's going on. And that's why it's another reason why I stress the notes, because even though we're not counting the falcons, we're not counting the eagles, their presence has a direct bearing on what's going on with the birds that are breeding there. One year, as I said, at Gull Rock, where the common murres were arriving earlier, and so they were really successful at pushing out the Brandt's cormorants. One year, every time it was Bill and Ellie was doing, they were going out there every single week, and the pair of peregrine falcons, for some reason, were perched on top of Gull Rock. And what it did was it kept the murres rafting in the water around the rock. It delayed their arrival. They were rafting there, they had gathered, but they weren't climbing up onto the rock yet. And it gave the cormorants an opportunity to regain some territory. And so that was the first year in 3 or 4 years that the Brandt's cormorants were nesting on that rock, simply because of the influence of 3 or 4 weeks of the presence of the peregrine falcons there. So we've been learning an awful lot about the interactions between species that we're not necessarily monitoring directly, simply through observation. It was interesting because a few years ago, we were also one of the first groups to notice the absence of the peregrine falcons. And I raised the question with Peter Pyle, who is a well-known ornithologist. And he says, oh, well, that's kind of interesting. And interesting that you lost all of them. And then he was involved with the Christmas bird count and got in touch with me right away, because an area in Point Reyes that he counts every single year for the Christmas bird count, suddenly there are no peregrine falcons at the end of that year. And so there are things that we're picking up on that are of value to others that are doing different kinds of projects up and down the coast. Just from being there, just from your observations.
I can see how the notes could be useful
Yeah.
Later on too, even if it's not apparent in the moment.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But it's also the flavor of what's going on. And so we're all learning just from being out there year after year after year. There was 1 year, it was before the program started, and I was photographing nesting birds out on Bodega Head. And in May, the wind suddenly stopped. Well, I'm a bluff hiker and a beach walker, and I really don't like getting beaten up by the wind. And to me, 3 weeks in May with no wind was just paradise. It was wonderful. But the pelagic cormorants had started, they had been nesting out there. They had been building their nests, and they all abandoned their nests. Now, the chicks hadn't hatched yet, so they were abandoning eggs. And out on the Farallons, the common murres that nest earlier, they were abandoning their chicks. But what happens is that wind that's beating us up every spring is what generates the upwelling, which generates the food supply, for the entire marine ecosystem out there. So those 3 weeks, the food system just died. And again, when I opened and I was talking about why monitor seabirds, it's because one reason is because it tells you what's going on in the ocean. And this was a prime example. So now our mantra when we're out there getting beaten up by the god-awful wind is, well, at least it's good for the upwelling. At least it's good for the upwelling. But it was a stark lesson that what felt really comfortable to us had, long-ranging effects on these birds that are trying to reproduce and make a living out there. So it's just one of those things that you might know intellectually, but when you're out there week after week after week, you start to know on a different level.
Does anyone have any other questions or anything about the onboarding or anything like that?
I've got a question about how many people tend to be on a crew. Does it vary much between different sites? It seems like Gull Rock might benefit from more people. And do you try to steer people to areas that are relatively underserved?
It's interesting. Gull Rock has its own, they call themselves the Gull Rockers. And they're very, very loyal to Gull Rock. They're out there every week for the most part. It's hard to keep them away. And it's really good because Gull Rock often requires 2 or 3 people to be counting, simply because of the numbers. Your eyes get tired. You mentioned Bill Perry, and he's got a lot of experience, and so it's really great having him out there week after week after week. And I don't know if I mentioned this. Our counts out there max out at about 8,000. So 3 or 4 years ago, the California Coastal National Monument, who funded us for our first 5 years, they had a little bit of money. And so there had been some aerial surveys that were done along the coast, and aerial photographs of Gull Rock and the colony there existed, but they ran out of funds for someone to do the actual counts, from the photography. So they hired Phil Capitolo, who works down at UC Santa Cruz, to do a count. And he sent me the numbers, and I was stunned because he was seeing 15,000 common murres on Gull Rock. This was the same, I pulled our numbers for that same week that the photographs had been taken, where we were seeing 8,000. So we're only seeing half of what's going on out there because we're counting from shore. So I say that it maxes out at 8,000. All of a sudden, that number will drop to 4,000 or 5,000. And what that tells us is that chicks have hatched, because that first session, when their numbers are increasing, they're on eggs. And so their foraging pressures aren't as intense. When that number drops to about 4,000 or 5,000, we know that chicks have hatched, and the parents are having to spend more time out at sea foraging and bringing food back to feed those youngsters. So even though it's a third of a mile out and we can't see what's going on, their behavior is telling us what's going on to an extent. So it's an interesting sight. So there's generally 3 or 4 people out at Gull Rock. Is Karen still on? Because she's a Gull Rocker. And
No, she went.
okay. Bodega Rock is generally a couple of people. So is Gleason, and so is Bodega Head West. But Bodega Head West became so complicated last year with so many common murres moving in, and so many Brandt's cormorants moving in, because they're being pressured by the common murres from these other sites, that it was becoming longer and longer to count, and we have different vantage points. So it'd really be nice if we had a couple of extra people out there this year.
And kind of as you
I come up
said,
from-
people are welcome to, try all the different sites as it fits to your schedule and see if there's one that you feel really particularly where you want to be.
Yeah, most people gravitate to one or another. And then some of us, if, for example, we'll notice on the schedule that maybe there's nobody scheduled for Gleason that week, and it's a Thursday and we're at Bodega Head, we'll move up to Gleason afterwards and do a count there. That's a quick count. That's the only site that has the double-crested corms. And a lot of them are on one rock that now that the peregrines are no longer nesting on that rock, there are more double-crested cormorants and Brandt's cormorants nesting on that rock, and it's very, very close. You really don't need a scope for that rock. And so we got to know some of the individual characters and personalities from that rock. There was one male that would fly off, and he would go off to pick vegetation for his nest, and he would be picking at a bush, and he would pull out a couple of sticks from this bush and stems, and then he'd kind of look it over and then discard it. And he was very, very picky and very, very selective about what he chose to bring back to the nest, and he would drop off this single little thing and then go back and start the whole process all over again. So as I said, I'm really into the behaviors. So I was just having a ball watching him. I do not know what kind of what his standards were and why some of the sticks that he pulled met them and why some of them didn't, but he was really, really fun to watch for an hour. So there are different things that are going on at different sites that are more interesting to some people than to others.
So this is a good time to talk about the in-person training. And we're still in the process of deciding. Hollis is figuring out whether we'll meet at Bodega Head East or West. So when we send the follow-up, I'll send a follow-up to this pretty soon in the next couple days with the recording on it and a reminder about the in-person. And then we'll send you one even closer to the day that tells you, or will we meet at East or West Bodega Head. And while I'm talking to you, I have a note to Hollis mentioned that we have a locker where at the Salmon Creek Ranger Station where all the equipment is, and probably eventually, if you volunteer, you'll probably meet someone there to pick up the equipment. And I just want to mention that it is a state parks like ranger. It's a working yard, lots of trucks and everything. So we've been asked that when we go in and out of there, just to make sure that we're not blocking anyone and we're sort of out of the way of all their trucks. I usually try and park in over at the right. And if the rangers come up, because they'll often come up and ask people what they're doing there or how they can help them, you just explain that you're a volunteer for Stewards and that you're picking up the equipment and they'll be fine with it. But I just wanted to give you a heads up that they're more busy there and also very service oriented. So they're always wanting to know who's there. Do you want to add anything, Hollis, about the in-person or anything else?
Well, the in-person, we've normally met on the east side, the east parking lot, and walked down to the southern tip of Bodega Head and viewed Bodega Rock. And the one advantage to that is that it gives people an opportunity for some hands-on experience with the scope. But if there are a number of us, it's hard for everybody to be able to take advantage of that. Saturday, there were about 150 common murres that were rafting in the water on the west side. Now, they've been rafting in the water up at Gull Rock off and on for the past couple of weeks. But Saturday, there were 1,000 of them, over 1,000 of them that were on the rock itself. So if the murres are actually on the rocks, and they should be, because this is about 10 days from now, I would prefer that we go to the west side simply because of the proximity. I mean, we're looking right at them, and there were several Brandt's cormorants that were gathering there. Half of them were in breeding plumage. It's a really nice opportunity to see these birds up close. So I'm leaning towards the west side right now. If they haven't gathered there, if they haven't climbed the rock, if they haven't gotten down to business, and there isn't that much to see, and then I would prefer to go to the east side. But right now, if things continue the way they are, then we'll probably be on the west side. If there's time, we can do both. So are there any other questions? Well, I'm sorry I ran long. I was kind of ripping through as quickly as I could. What about those? I'm interested in those of you who have not had a lot of experience with monitoring or with seabirds. And is any of this intimidating to any of you? Good. Good. It's a friendly, fun thing to be doing. Fun way to spend your morning.
It's community science because it's, comes from the community and it's very community building science too.
It is. It is. It's a nice community of people. And you don't have to write haiku, but it's fun if you do.
Along the lines, oh, sorry. I,
So
I,
we should, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
oh, sorry. I was just gonna say along the lines of community, it's becoming apparent how interconnected the community is because I see familiar faces and I'm relatively new to birding. Um, yeah, so it's fun.
And there are different levels of birding. I'm not a lister. I've never had a list. You know, there are those that are into the big year or whatever, and they're racing out to get the rarities so that they can, add them to their list. I could construct a list if I needed to because those that are less common are kind of plugged into my brain. But that's not what's interesting to me. It's more of, I keep saying the behavior. And so there are all different kinds of birders that have different kinds of personalities and different levels of interest. And that makes it interesting as well.
Alex, you may have said this already, but who's taking the data that we're generating?
The data is posted that people have access to it.
Okay, so anybody.
Yeah, anybody. There is the Seabird Protection Network has a all-day conference once a year. We all report. It's kind of
Okay.
interesting to see what's going on elsewhere, especially with avian flu the past
Yeah.
couple of years, because it was confirmation that we weren't the only ones losing our peregrine falcons, for example. There are also Brandt's cormorants tend to have boom and bust years. They'll have a really, really strong productive year and then not so strong. I think last year, there's a large colony out on Alcatraz, and they had twice as many chicks as they had been having in other years. So we share information, among each other with little brief reports, but it's, they you can call them baseline numbers right now, but there are trends that are happening now. Some of those are disease related right now, but it's the main interest that biologists have are the impacts on climate.
Mhm.
And those aren't seen from year to year because the conditions change from year to year. You can have a marine heat wave for 2 or 3 years, which obviously has a huge impact on the food supply. And then things will normalize, but they're tracking trends. So the numbers are available to anybody who is interested in them. And another thing I wanted to mention, Paul Hovey, who manages the Seabird Protection Network, he actually works for NOAA and for the Greater Farallones Marine Sanctuary. He'll be joining us on our site visit. And today he asked if he could bring a couple of staff members. They have a new, they do a lot of outreach to pilots and boaters to educate them to try to minimize disturbances. And so they have a new aviation person that is anxious to come out and see what's going on the ground. So they'll be joining us for the site visit.
Thank you.
As I said, it's the numbers, the numbers are important to them. But and that's why we're doing it. But there's also just the experience of being there and kind of absorbing, the environment. It gives you, as Diane says, I'm never going to look at an offshore rock the same again. And now I live in Stinson Beach, so I'm driving the coastal route down to Tam Junction to Mill Valley all the time. There are 2 rocks that are offshore down near Slide Ranch, south of Muir Beach, that are pure white. They don't look high enough out of the water for breeding rocks, but I'm definitely pulling out my scope one of these days when I have time to see what's going on there. And this is what happens when you've been looking at these rocks for a while. You become curious about what you're seeing out there if they're covered with guano. Well, thank you all for joining us tonight. And I hope to see you in a couple of weeks at Bodega Head.